So point of clarification and then a couple questions. So one, to speak to you, Will, I do think self-defense is natural and innate. I do not think collective violence as a response is primary. So I think that if the black community felt that there could be some sort of other recourse, and not just black people, I think any marginalized group, the LGBT community or whoever, thought that there was some institutional place that they could go and have their collective grievance be met and receive some sort of justice, that people would move to a collective response on violence. So by the time marginalized groups engaged in the phase of armed struggle, so much violence has already happened. They've exhausted all of the possibilities. There's been all the talking that can possibly happen. There's no more petitions, no more door. They've exhausted all of those. Yeah, they not. But they've exhausted all of the possibilities. So that's what I was referring to, which is why I think Baltimore and Ferguson were extremely important, because they demonstrated the place that the black community was at. There was no other place to go to talk about violence that they were experiencing from the police. Who could you go to? Who could you tell? And so much violence had been happening that up until that point, I guarantee you that if Freddie Gray was the first victim of police murder, that you would have seen a urban rebellion. You would have seen it. But so the question I have is, given that Rodney King, urban rebellion, Ferguson, urban rebellion, Baltimore, urban rebellion, you all talked about the unintended consequence, and you even talked about Huey and him sort of saying like, oh, we should do violence. Do urban rebellions work? I'll sit back.
I guess so. So the problem is they have consequences. And some of those consequences are positive, some may be negative. So my son-in-law, who's from Cincinnati, stresses that before the 2001 Cincinnati riot, the police had killed a person a year or more than a person a year for the last decade. And after the Cincinnati riot, which was about the police shooting a guy in the back because he was running away, there was no more police killing in Cincinnati for a decade. And definitely, see, riots are usually not that well organized. I mean, what actually happens, maybe there's provocateurs who try to get it go, but how a riot actually happens is most of the time somebody starts something and then some other people pull away and other people join in and the police overreact or they underreact and it gets going, right? It's an emergent phenomenon. It's not typically something that people start on purpose. So the clear research that there was an increase in poverty funds after the 1960s riots, and there's other places where that's true. More attention to the problem. You know, in 1968, whites said, there's this one survey that whites were asked, would you raise your own taxes by 10% to improve the situation for black people? Well, first of all, you can just think of the political context where you would ask anybody whether they'd raise their own taxes for anything, including themselves. But, you know, the majority of whites said yes. They would.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in answering your question, I think it's important to ask what, you know, do they work to do what? And I agree that I mean, riots clearly have repeatedly called attention to long-standing problems. So, you know, after Rodney King was beaten, it was actually after Rodney. This is an interesting, I think, proof of your point that the initial response is usually not violence, right? So after Rodney King's beating, there actually wasn't riots. It was actually after the acquittal of police officers, which was a long time afterwards, months after. But that, you know, then President Bush Sr. went to LA. He promised new funds for urban renewal. Clinton, who was running for president, went. He made the same promises. So it called a lot of attention. I think the problem is how that moves forward. So I think riots are very rarely, I mean, by definition almost, are not organized. They're not carried out by people who are organized in a way that they're preparing to wield power. And I think we've seen repeatedly that the only way to address these long-standing injustices is to empower people, and for people to empower themselves. And I think that rioting does not actually further that. And in fact, I think rioting is often an indication that people are not organized in a way that they actually can wield power. So I think that in the short term, yes, they certainly call attention to a problem, but whether they work in the way of a sort of lead to a long-term solution, I think that it's actually the opposite, which is people who are disciplined or organized into a disciplined movement that can actually prevent violence. I think that was repeatedly the argument that's been made about nonviolence, is that it's actually, it takes that type of organization and self-discipline, organized self-discipline, to actually keep people from rioting. And that's what I mean about directing people's energy into actually changing the situation. And I think wielding power I think if any social movement is serious about changing the world, it has to prepare itself for governance. And, and that it requires a very high level of organization.